Good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. I've got a couple things I want to say before we get into our lesson together. First of all, shout out to Kathy Gramling, who makes the stage look good. You make Josh look good while he's up here. So thank you for doing that, putting that in. Thank you to everyone who has poured into all of the different youth things that we've had going on this summer for camp and for VBS. It's at that point in the year where we can breathe again a little bit. And so to all of you who poured into that, I just want to say thank you. You've been such a huge blessing to me, a huge blessing to this group of people, to our community. If you're visiting with us this morning, we're so glad that you're here. We want you to know that we are so thankful that you chose to be with us at Southwest. This is a group of people who love Jesus so much and just strive to please him in everything that we do. And I'm so glad that you're here this morning. You know, a few days ago, the Guadalupe rivers, or the river, rose in Kerrville, Texas, faster than anyone could have imagined. In a matter of moments, ordinary life was swept away. Roads collapsed, homes were flooded, families were separated, places that were supposed to be a safe haven became places of terror, and tragically, so many lives were lost. And it's hard, if not impossible, to feel shaken up when we see things like this. We watch the news, we scroll through social media, we look through images, and we do so hoping that these things aren't real. We're no strangers here to tragedy in Oklahoma City. And as we know, it isn't always someone else's story. Sometimes it's ours. Whether that's cancer diagnosis, sudden accidents, broken relationships, miscarriages, suicides, job loss, mental illness. Around the world, fires burn out of control, hurricanes destroy coastal towns, tornadoes rip through communities. Tragedy is everywhere. And sometimes it's from nature. Sometimes it hits at the hands of other people, and sometimes it's just the brokenness of living in a fallen world. But whatever the cause, the pain is the same, isn't it? And these tragedies have a way of making us ask certain questions like, God, where are you? How could you allow this? Why this? Why now? How do I even begin to move forward from this? This morning, I'm not here to tell you and even try to act like I have an answer for why those things happen. I just know they happen. And I know that those things are very difficult to live through, and it's hard to bear most, if not all of the time. And so this morning, I simply want to try to navigate tragedy with you. Not try to explain it, but try to navigate it with you with a faith that can endure, and with a God who is near, and with a hope that will not disappoint. And so how I want us to work through this time together this morning is I want to start by looking at one of God's men who experienced unimaginable tragedy and how he worked through it, and then transition into how we can work through tragedy when we suffer, and then talk about how we're called to minister to others when they experience tragedy. So let's begin by looking at when God's man experienced tragedy. If you have your Bible, open with me to the book of Job. And we're going to start in Job chapter 1, kind of work our way through the first two chapters. And we don't have time to dive into all the details of Job's story. But right when you open to Job chapter 1, verse 1, you see the story of Job. And his story is personal, it's raw, it's honest, and what you see in Job's story is the reality of overwhelming tragedy. The book of Job begins with Job's description. Verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. It goes on to tell us how Job was blessed with abundant wealth. He had a loving family, and he had an unwavering faith in God. But as you find throughout chapter 1, despite his blameless life, Job was not immune to a series of calamities that was brought about from this meeting with Satan and the sons of God and God himself. And in a swift and devastating turn of events, what you see in chapter 1, verses 13 through 19, is that Job loses mostly everything that was close to him. In a ridiculous wave of tragedy, Job loses his possessions, his house, and his children. And as you see from Job, it shakes him up, it devastates him, but he continues to trust in God. Well, you get to chapter 2, and in chapter 2, Job undergoes this other wave of tragedy. This time it directly affects his physical health. And so at this point in Job's life, almost everything in his life has been turned completely upside down. But what you find throughout the rest of Job's story is his endurance through faith. That despite the unimaginable suffering that Job has experienced, he refused to abandon his faith. Now, what that looks like in Job's story is in his anguish, Job wrestled with profound questions about the nature of suffering and God's justice. What you see throughout his story is he questions, he laments, but he never wavered in his belief in God's goodness. And throughout all the questions he asks, throughout all of the statements he makes, you never see God getting mad at Job for those hard questions. However, you do see God getting upset with the people that say the different things that they say to him throughout his book. As you think about his wife, in the midst of this tragedy, what does she tell Job to do? Job, curse God and die. And he tries to correct her mindset and challenge her to understand why he's still able to cling to God despite those tragedies. You have Job's friends come into the picture, and they come along and they offer misguided advice, and they accuse him of wrongdoings and urging him to forsake his faith. But Job remains steadfast. And he makes such a profound statement found in chapter 13, verse 15. And he says, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And through Job's perseverance, he teaches us the importance of being able to cling to our faith even in the midst of overwhelming trials. And that faith that he had built up throughout his life, now in this time of tragedy, had to become the anchor that sustained him through the storm and that gave him strength and hope to push on and to continue to endure. Now, what about us? Like when we experience tragedy, what are we called to do? How do we handle it? And I start by saying this. Unfortunately for you and I, it is not if we are going to suffer, it is when. It's not, are you going to face some sort of tragedy in your life? It is, when are you going to face some sort of tragedy in your life? Suffering is a universal experience that touches every single one of us. Tragedy transcends boundaries of culture and age and status. From the beginning of time, humanity has grappled with tragedy, with pain, with loss, with adversity. And while some forms of tragedy may be more visible or tangible than others, all forms carry a weight that can be and are often burdensome and overwhelming. And so as we think about the universality of suffering, I bring this up to remind you that you never have to be alone in the midst of your suffering. That in the midst of your suffering, in the midst of life trials, in the midst of the tragedies you find yourself or your family going through, I want to encourage you to draw from the fact that God has given us each other to lean on, to utilize each other. And if we don't do that, what we see happen a lot of the times is we find ourselves incredibly tempted to give up. In life, have you ever felt like you wanted to give up before? Have you ever felt like you wanted to abandon your faith? Have you ever felt in the midst of tragedy to turn your back on God? You know, in times of suffering, I think it's very common to grapple with God's goodness and his presence and have doubts about that. We may wonder, how could a loving God allow so much pain and hardship to exist in this world? In moments of intense suffering, we may cry out to God for answers, for relief, for a sign of his presence. Just, God, give me something to know that you're here in this moment. Yet often, in the midst of tragedy and shortly thereafter, it seems as though our prayers go unanswered and God remains quiet. Maybe you relate with the psalmist in Psalm 10 when he says this, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" The silence, it can deepen our doubts. It can cause us to question whether God hears us, whether he cares for us, or whether he exists at all. Can I offer you two passages as a way of encouragement? If you've been here before, or maybe you find yourself in this moment right now. Consider Psalm chapter 34, verses 15 through 19. This is David writing. And he spends chapter 4 talking about the goodness of God. And he says this, starting in verse 15. "The eyes of the Lord are towards the righteous, and his ears towards their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Isn't it fascinating that it's in those moments of tragedy when we feel like God is the most distant? David says, no. It's in those moments when the Lord is most near to you. So cry out to him. Call out for him because he is near the brokenhearted. He desires to save those who are crushed in spirit. Consider a passage in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. This is Paul opening his letter to the church in Corinth, and he says this, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort." And notice what the God of all comfort does. He comforts us in all of our afflictions. That word comfort in the Greek means to call to one side. That he is this God that when we are hurting and we cry out to him, he doesn't say, "No, stay over there. You can figure it out on your own. Stay over there." He calls us to our side, to his side. And he hurts with us and he offers this comfort to us. And so in the midst of the temptation to give up, please remind yourself that there is always hope. And another aspect of considering when we experience tragedy, we're called to simply trust in God's sovereignty in our suffering. And while suffering may seem senseless or arbitrary, we are called to trust that God is still on the throne and he is still reigning and is still in control of things. That even in a world that is so crooked and full of tragedy, God is able some way to take those tragedies and use them towards his end and to use them for good. It's not that God causes them, but he can use them. I know John brought this up in his sermon last week, but again, I'm reminded of what Joseph said to his brothers. At the end of this story, as Joseph went through all of these horrible things at the hands of his brothers, he calls them to himself and he says to them, "You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good." God was able to take this tragedy at the hands of his brothers, what they did to him, and meaning it for evil, God was able to take that and use it for something good. And what can be so healthy and healing for us while we're dealing with tragedy can be to find hope in the fact that God is still in control. And he's able to take the most tragic of situations and yet bring goodness out of them. And we can trust him. And we can count on him. And we can turn to him when we find ourselves in the midst of tragedies because he's here. And as the psalmist says, he's near. And he sees the pain that you're going through. And he is the God of all comfort. How about when we recognize others are experiencing tragedies? How do we deal with that? As you read through the scriptures, it's overwhelmingly there that we are called to show compassion to those who are hurting. As followers of Christ, as Paul would say in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, we're called to bear one another's burdens. He'd say it this way: bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That you and I are to not just look at the tragedy that's going on in the world, to not just look at the situation that happened in Kerrville a few days ago and just be like, oh man, that really stinks for them. No, we're called to bear their burdens, to get in their shoes, to feel what they're feeling, to suffer with them as they're suffering. Consider what Paul says continuing in 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4. We didn't finish this, but as you consider the God of all comfort who comforts us in all of our affliction, we take that comfort that we've received from God as he called us to his side, and notice what we do. Sorry, allergies. So that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. I take this comfort that I've received and I take it to my brother. I take it to my sister. I take it to my community who may be hurting. And why can we do that? Because he's the God of all comfort, who comforted us in all of our afflictions. And we pass that on with the comfort with which we ourselves have been comforted by God. See, compassion lies at the heart of the Christian faith. And it prompts us to enter into the suffering of others with empathy and love. And that doesn't mean we have to have all of the answers or know exactly what they're feeling. I think it's actually important to guard ourselves against the tendency to act like we know exactly what someone is going through, or to offer explanations in order to frame a crisis as to give it purpose and meaning. You know, sometimes in our desire to comfort the grieving and to show compassion, we feel the need to give comfort by trying to make sense of what is often senseless. You know, for example, as you consider when Job's friends visited him, I think we can learn some lessons in empathy from them. If you look at Job chapter 2, verse 13, initially, Job's friends, they just show up and they simply sit silently with him and they hurt with him. Sometimes the most powerful form of support we can offer is simply being present with those who are hurting. In our willingness to sit with them in their pain, it communicates louder than words could ever communicate. However, Job's friends, their attempt to explain his suffering and their attempt to try to tell him as to why he's dealing with what he's going through, it ultimately is what leads them to their own condemnation and judgment. And I think what we can learn from that is sometimes the worst thing we can ever do for people in the attempt to show compassion and empathy is to open our mouths. Again, sometime in our desire to comfort the grieving, we feel the need to give comfort by making sense of what is often senseless. You know, my great brother, Jacob Rutledge, who many of you know, he wrote a Facebook post a few days ago, and speaking from experience of someone who lost his son, who he didn't get to experience any life with, he wrote this. He said, when people lose children, they don't want to hear how heaven has gained a new angel. They certainly can't see how this is in God's greater plan, even though in faith we trust it does and will one day. They don't want to hear that their children were just too good for this world and how it will all make sense in the end. Having someone try to frame their grief in a way that is foreign to them can make you unintentionally come across as insensitive, even with your best motives in mind. And I thought there was a lot of wisdom and power in his words. But from Job's story, we can learn from Job's friends the importance of listening with empathy rather than rushing to try to provide answers. When you find your friends or your brothers or your sisters or communities that are dealing with tragedy, hurt with them. Be there for them. Pray for them. Be patient with them. Be careful with what you say and how we say it and who we say it to, especially when speaking about tragedies such as what happened down in Kerrville. Weep with them. pray with them. And when you encounter someone going through such tragedy, affirm your love and offer support and sit with them in silence. Offer an empathetic presence. Say things such as, I'm so sorry this happened, or my heart is breaking for you, or I'm here for you. Connect without the needing to fix, because the reality is you can't fix it. As I think about this call to empathy and this call to compassion, I'm reminded about Jesus and how what we're doing is we're modeling ourselves after Jesus, because ultimately our response to the suffering of others should reflect the love and the compassion of Christ. As you think about Jesus throughout his earthly ministry here on this earth, he exemplified compassion and love for the hurting and for the marginalized. He healed the sick. He comforted those who were grieving. He showed kindness to those who simply needed a hand. And as his followers, we're called to emulate his example by us extending compassion to those who are hurting. That might include, providing meals for people, running errands, offering financial assistance, or lending a helping hand in tangible ways. But in reaching out to those who are hurting, we exemplify his love, and we extend his healing touch to a world that is so overwhelmed by tragedy. And when I look at Jesus, his love was not merely expressed in words, but it was also demonstrated through the most mind-blowing thing that he could have done. Ultimately, we started with this. In times of suffering, in times of tragedy, we ask God, where are you? Why are you letting this happen? A man by the name of John Lennox said this that I couldn't help but share. He said, granted that this world is messy, this world is full of two things: beauty and barbed wire. And is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that you can trust with that ultimately? See, at the very heart of Christianity, there is a cross. And on that cross was a man by the name of Jesus who claimed to be God. And so the question is, what is God doing on a cross? Why is he there? And what it shows us is that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become a part of it. What we learn from the doctrine of the incarnation, God becoming flesh, and the crucifixion, is that God became human and suffered right alongside us so that he can actually understand our suffering and can hurt with us when we suffer. Isn't that incredible? Consider how the writer of Hebrews says it in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. That despite the pervasive reality of suffering, the Christian faith offers something that nothing else can, and that is hope in the midst of despair. The story of redemption culminating in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it promises ultimate victory over suffering and death, and there is nothing else in the world that can offer that. Atheism cannot offer that. But the fact that God that suffered on the cross rose from the dead, that opens up a whole world of possibility. It opens up the certainty that there is going to be a final judgment, and that terrorists are not going to get away with what they've done, that school shooters are not going to get away with what they've done, but that God is going to be just and he will deal with it. And so what then is the conclusion? Because Jesus entered into our broken world and suffered alongside us and is now in heaven at the right side of God, sympathizing with us. Verse 16. Let us then with confidence. Draw near to the throne of grace. With confidence, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. You know, atheists and people in the world, they might make fun of Christians when on certain posts Christians comment, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for this situation. And they might ask questions like, how can thoughts and prayers ever help something like this in this situation? It may not fix it in regards to bringing someone back to life or physically undoing such tragedies. But as I read this verse, there is nothing better that I can do than to draw near to the throne of grace so that I can receive mercy and find grace in time of need. And thanks be to God that that's the kind of God He is, that He is near to the brokenhearted, that every tear that has ever been shed has never gone unnoticed, and that every prayer offered on behalf of those who have had something tragic happen to them has been heard by the God of the universe. It's amazing. You know, this lesson doesn't naturally lead itself or lend itself to an invitation to respond to the gospel, other than when you look at what God did for us in entering into our world and suffering alongside us, how could you not want to give your life over to Him? You know, this life is so unpredictable. I hate that I don't know when my last breath is going to be on this earth. I hate that I don't know if my kids are going to get to live long, healthy lives. I hate that I don't get to know what their story looks like. I hate that I don't know the next time that I'm going to get to see you. But that's life. And the unpredictability of life and living in this fallen world should cause us to ask some questions and to do some self-reflecting. To look at our own lives and ask, you know, today, if I were to lose my life today, am I ready to meet the Lord with confidence? Am I ready to stand face to face with King Jesus? And do I know what His answer will be to me? Will it be enter in or will it be depart from me? I think there's some serious self-reflection that needs to be done as you consider living in this world, because one day, whether you experience another tragedy in your life or not, all of life on earth here will be transferred into a new eternal realm. And you will face King Jesus, and every knee will bow. So the question is, will you be bowing in submission, or will you be bowing in humiliation? So this morning, as you find yourself sitting here and as you're contemplating where you're at with the Lord, and as you might find yourself dealing with tragedies or asking these tough questions, this invitation's for you to simply consider, am I right with the Lord this morning? To maybe you're sitting here and you're really struggling. As we talked about, maybe you're dealing with tragedy alone and you're bottling it up. You've not let it out. Call on the church to be with you, to hurt with you, to pray with you. If there's any need for you to respond to the invitation this morning, we want to give you that opportunity to handle that right now as together we stand and we sing.